Welcome back! In the next few lessons, we're going to learn about applications, both in the desktop and server, of Linux environments. But before we do that, I'm going to show you how to use the Linux Essentials Lab server that we've developed and set up specifically to follow along with us in this particular course. You can access this lab server both via SSH, and now you can even access the X Windows GUI environment by using VNC. So let's go ahead and walk through how to access this particular lab server now. When you're logged into the Linux Academy website, you may have already gone through the Introduction to Linux Academy course. If you have not done so, I highly recommend you do that because we specifically teach you how our courses work, how our learning plans work, and how to connect to both the servers from OS X, Linux, and Windows. Again, if you want to access the Linux Essentials server, all you have to do up towards the top is click on the Server Lab button. When you click on the Linux Server Lab button, you are presented with 4 servers that you have options to start up that you can then connect and follow along with depending on whatever course that you're currently going through. What we're specifically interested in is the Linux Essentials Lab server. If I click my very first Linux server here, drop down, I have all these different options of different distributions of Linux. What we want to do is pick the one that says Linux Essentials right here. Once I've done that, under the Server Actions buttons, I can click Play, which will start up my very first Linux Essentials Lab server. Let's go ahead and do that. This lab server is based on the CentOS version 7 operating system. We've specifically set up on this distribution. On this particular server, we have actually set up VNC so that you can connect via the X Windows environment and follow along with me throughout the course. When we first click on this, it can take a few minutes, and you'll notice here underneath the status it says starting. Once we get a public IP address here and the status running, which is now changed to, we can actually connect via SSH to this server. We cannot yet connect to this server with VNC because we haven't set up the VNC user yet. You can also connect not only on the public IP, but also with your host public name. We've set up the domain mylabserver.com to be able to be used to follow along for easy host names throughout your different Linux courses that we provide here. So for example, since this is my first server, my first part of my host name would be Stephen1.mylabserver.com or Stephen1b.mylabserver.com. For the sake of simplicity real quick, I'm just going to use my public IP and head over to my terminal so that we can SSH to this particular public IP address. So let's go ahead and first use SSH. We're going to use the user at the IP address of the public IP address that we just were shown in our control panel. Again, in our control panel, our public IP is here. But how do we know to use the user? Well, right here underneath the lab frequently asked questions, you'll notice that we have the default server user. The default server pass is just 123.456. And note, the default root pass is also 123.456. So let's go ahead and hit enter to connect to our server. The first time that you connect, we must accept the RSA key fingerprint, so go ahead and hit yes. Again, the password is 123.456. And we are now connected to my Stephen1 hostname. You'll notice that I know this by looking at the user, followed by the actual hostname. So it's at Stephen1. So the very first thing that we need to do is change your password. This is the first thing you always want to do when setting up your server for the very first time. Now, I know we haven't gone over any commands yet. In fact, this might be the very first time that you've even connected to a Linux terminal. Don't worry about the commands I'm going to give you in specifics yet, because we will go over these in detail throughout this course. But this is what we need to do to get our lab server ready to start following along. So the first thing that I want to do is type PASWD. This is for changing our password. If you type PASWD, it will then prompt us for our current Unix password. Again, that's simply 123.456, so let's enter that and hit enter. Then we're going to define what we want our new password to be. So I'm going to go ahead and define what I want mine to be now, followed by enter, and then retype that password again. If your password was accepted, it will basically say authentication tokens were updated successfully. The second thing that we need to do is change our root password. This is also very important. So how do we become the root user or change the password of a root user? Well, it's very simple, by using the super user command. We do that by typing su, that stands for super user. Then we're going to use space and then a dash that will actually take us to the root prompt. So when we do that, it's going to prompt us for a root password. Again, if you look back on the control panel, you'll notice that the default root password is still also 123456. So let's enter that now. When logging into the root user for the very first time, it will force you to change this password. Please note you cannot change this password to 123456. It will not accept that password. It has to be a new good password. Make sure that you remember this password later on. I'm going to go ahead and enter what I want my root password to be. Then I'm going to retype that password. And we have now successfully changed our root password. Now, once we've done that, that's really all we need to do so far within this lesson. So let's go ahead and back out. Now that we'll notice, again, right here, we're root at Stephen1. So we are now the root user logged into this Linux terminal. So to back out, we just simply type exit. If we do that followed by enter, you'll notice it logs us out, and we are now back to the original user, which is user, that we logged into this Linux terminal server session with. So the very first thing that we need to do is set up our Linux server to be able to access it with a VNC application, which gives us the actual desktop, much like a Windows desktop or an OS X desktop, that we can access our Linux server with. If we do an ls command, this is an ls or list command that actually shows all the files in the current directory that we are in. Again, we'll go over these commands later, but that's what I'm doing. I'm typing ls to show the different files and or folders that are in the current folder that I'm in. You'll notice that there's this VNC how-to file. This VNC how-to file has quick steps on being able to actually set up your VNC session. We're going to do that step by step here, but just so you know, later on when you're setting up this particular server, or maybe you've deleted this server and restarted it, this is how you would actually set it up again. I'm going to actually use the cat command. Again, we've not used the cat command before, but what the cat command will actually do is print out all of the contents of a particular file. So if I wanted to actually view the contents of this VNC how-to file, I would do cat space the name of the file followed by enter, which would actually print out all of the contents of that particular file. So first let's take a look at these instructions. What do we need to do to set up our VNC access to our server? Well, all we really need to do is use the VNC passwd command, which will actually prompt us to create a strong password that we need to remember later on for connecting to our Linux Academy lab server. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm logged into our server again as user. All I need to do is type the command that this particular file actually told us to do. So if I type VNC passwd, this is going to prompt us to enter a password that we want this to be when accessing the Windows GUI part of this X Windows session. So I'm going to go ahead and enter what I want that password to be. It's going to ask us to verify it. That basically means just re-enter that same password that you chose followed by enter. Once we're back to our prompt, that means we've successfully set up our VNC password. In order for this to actually take place, we actually need to reboot our Linux server. In order to reboot a Linux server, first of all, we need to be root. So as I showed you a few moments ago, if I type su followed by the dash, it will actually prompt us to enter in what we set our root password to be. So go ahead and enter that followed by enter. All right, so you'll notice again we're logged in as root. I know that because it says root at the name of the host, which is Stephen1 for me. I can now reboot our Linux server. To reboot a Linux server, once you are root or sudo privileges, we'll talk about what sudo privileges are later on. But in order to reboot it, once we are root, we'll just type simply reboot. And what this will do is actually shut down our Linux Academy server, and then it will restart it back up. Now, I want to tell you right now, because a lot of people start trying to connect right away after they've done reboot, but their server isn't ready yet. This is going to take a few minutes. The server has to be shut down, and then it's going to actually start back up clean and restart with all the settings. And really the only setting that we've changed is we've actually just set up a password for VNC. While we're waiting a few minutes for this particular server to come back up, I still have the instructions on my screen here. So what do we need to do next? Well, what we need to do next, in order to connect to our VNC session, we need to get a VNC viewer application. I'm going to recommend going to realvnc.com because they offer a free viewer. Now, all you need to do is find the installer that happens to be for the operating system that you're currently on. You could either be on Linux, and if you are, kudos to you, or if you're on a Windows or OS X machine, find the installer and download and run using all the default prompts and install your realvnc viewer application. Once that is installed and your Linux server is running, we're going to use the VNC viewer using our public IP address. Again, we can see that looking here in our public IP. This is going to be the same IP address that we just used on SSH that we're also going to use in VNC. What we're going to do is use that IP address followed by colon, and what we want to do is connect to the VNC session of user. VNC session of user is always going to be port 5901 on the Linux Academy Linux Essentials server. So our server should be back up by now, so I'm going to go ahead and find my VNC viewer application that I've already downloaded and installed. So what I'm going to do in my VNC viewer application, you'll notice here that it has VNC server : waiting for our IP address. So I'm going to go ahead and enter in my particular IP address. Remember, yours will be different. It's whatever is shown in the public IP of your Server Lab Control Center when logged into linuxacademy.com. And what we need to do is follow that IP address with the :5901, and then go ahead and either hit enter or click connect. First time that we connect, it's going to basically tell us this is an unencrypted connection. You can either hit "Don't worry me about this again," or just hit continue. Either way, it's just fine. Hit continue. Then it's going to prompt us for the password. The password is what we specified when we did the VNC passwd command previously. So go ahead and enter in the password that you set for this. Then go ahead and either click OK or hit enter. When we do that, it is going to connect us to our very own X Windows GUI environment. This happens to be the GNOME environment. In fact, CentOS 7, as well as Debian or Debian, depending on how you pronounce it, as well as Red Hat, typically uses a GNOME Windows and management environment for its Linux distribution. You'll notice it's very similar to either OS X or Windows, depending on what you're familiar with using, and that it has a menu application up here. We'll click on that. We have accessories. Right here we have a file browser. Under Office, we have OpenOffice. We have network connection settings. Under System Tools, we even have further settings that we're going to actually take a look at. So again, you get there by clicking Applications, System Tools, and then click Settings. Now what I want to take a look at, the only setting that I want to show you at this point, is underneath Hardware where it says Displays. If you click this, it's very similar to changing the resolution in a Microsoft Windows or OS X operating system. The reason I want to show you this is, let's say that you are on a lower resolution browser. The default resolution of the VNC setup for the Linux Essentials server is currently set at 1280 by 720. But let's say your resolution on your laptop or desktop, whatever you're connecting to this Linux Essentials server via VNC is also that same resolution, or it's even smaller. If you click this, you get a drop down here where you can change it to 1024 by 768 or even 800 by 600. You also have the option, let's say you're on a high resolution screen, much like me, I'm on 1920 by 1080. You can actually go up higher in resolution, making your window larger if you'd like to do that. I'm going to go ahead and leave mine at 1280 by 720 because it's just fine, but I want to show you this is how you would change that if you needed to change the size of your VNC viewer session. So that's how we connect to the Linux Academy Linux Essentials server. I hope you had fun in this lesson and connecting the very first time to your Linux server, both via SSH as well as GUI through the VNC viewer. In the next few lessons, we're going to learn about applications on Linux. So let's go ahead and finish this lesson and jump right in.